We told my brother that what he did to me was a mistake anyone could make. Then I stopped answering the phone, packed up my daughter, and moved 1,200 kilometers away. That was 6 years ago. My parents still don't fully understand why. I used to think family was something you kept no matter what. Not because it was always good, or safe, or honest, but because it was yours. You were born into it, and that meant something permanent, something like gravity. You don't choose gravity, you just live inside it. I was wrong about that. There are some betrayals that don't just damage a relationship. They reveal that the relationship you thought you had never really existed. And there are some moments when the people you love most look at you, understand exactly what you need from them, and choose something else instead. For my parents, that something else was my brother. His name is Preston. He is 3 years younger than me, and for as long as I can remember, he has been the version of a son. My parents were always a little more worried about, a little more tender toward, a little more willing to excuse. I was the one who kept his head down and handled things. Preston was the one who needed handling. I want to be clear that I am not saying any of this with bitterness anymore. I spent a long time being bitter. I earned the right to it. But what I am trying to do now is tell the truth, not to punish anyone, but because the truth is the only thing that has ever made any of the last 6 years make sense. I am 37 years old. I live in Halifax with my daughter, who is 9 now and who loves soccer, graphic novels, and putting too much hot sauce on everything she eats. I run a small renovation contracting business. I have a partner named Vivienne who makes me laugh every single day and who told me once, early on, that she had never met a man who had so clearly been raised to believe that his pain was an inconvenience to others. That sentence took me a long time to sit with. But I am getting ahead of myself. My name is Joel. And this is the story of what happened when I trusted my family with the most important thing I had, and what I did when they decided that protecting my brother mattered more than protecting me. My ex-wife's name is Renata. We met in university in Winnipeg, got married at 26, and had our daughter Maisie when we were 28. For the first few years, our marriage was the kind of thing that worked, because we were both trying. We had the same basic picture of what we wanted. A house. A business. A kid or two. Weekend dinners with family. The ordinary beautiful life that people build together. Without fully understanding how fragile ordinary things can be. Preston moved to Winnipeg when Maisie was 2. He said he needed a fresh start, after a business deal in Calgary went sideways, which was the version of events he told our parents. The version he told me, in private, was closer to the truth. He had borrowed money from a partner without asking, and the partnership had dissolved badly. He needed somewhere to land. Renata and I let him stay in our spare room for 6 weeks. Those 6 weeks became 4 months. At the time I told myself we were helping family. That was what our parents had always taught us to do. You show up for family, you give them a soft place to land, and then, when they are back on their feet, the investment pays off in loyalty and closeness, and the kind of bond you can only build through showing up for each other in hard times. I believed that genuinely. That is the part I have had to sit with the longest. Preston got a job eventually, moved into a basement apartment 20 minutes away, and became a regular fixture in our lives. Sunday dinners, Maisie's birthday parties, holidays. He was charming with her, the fun uncle who did voices and snuck her extra dessert. She adored him. I remember feeling, during that time, something close to pride. My brother and I had not been especially close growing up. There was always a gap between us. Something I could never fully name. He had friends easily. He moved through the world, like things would work out because they usually did, or because someone would step in and make them work out. I was different. I was the one who planned and saved and worried and showed up early. We were not enemies. But we were not the kind of brothers who called each other just to talk. I thought Winnipeg had changed that. I thought proximity and shared meals, and watching him be good, with my daughter, had built something real between us. I was wrong about that too. The first sign came about a year after Preston moved to his apartment. Renata started going to bed earlier than usual. When I mentioned it, she said she was tired. She was working long hours at the dental clinic. I accepted that. I was busy myself, bidding on a big commercial job that would take up most of my mental space for months if I got it. The second sign came when Preston stopped coming to Sunday dinners without explanation. He would cancel last minute, too tired. Plans came up. I asked him once what was going on. He said work was stressful. I let it go. I was good at letting things go. That was, I understand now, something I had been trained to do my entire life. The third sign I only recognized after the fact. Renata began asking questions about Preston. Careful questions, delivered casually. How was he doing? Did he seem happy? Had he mentioned dating anyone? I remember thinking she was being kind, looking out for him the way she looked out for everyone she cared about. That was the kind of person Renata was. The day I found out, I was picking Maisie up from my parents' place in Brandon. She had been there for the weekend, while Renata and I were supposed to have some time to ourselves. Except Renata had canceled that Friday, saying she needed the weekend to decompress alone. I had driven Maisie to Brandon on Thursday evening and come back to an empty house. When I arrived in Brandon on Sunday afternoon to pick Maisie up, my mother was sitting at the kitchen table, with a look on her face that I had seen before. It was the look she got when she knew something she did not want to be the one to say. My father was in the living room, pretending to watch football. I asked my mother if everything was okay. She said, "Sit down, Joel," and I knew. Not the specifics. But I knew the shape of it. That specific quality of dread that you feel when the people who love you most are sitting very still. She told me that my father had run into Renata the previous afternoon in Brandon. At the farmer's market. With Preston. They were not shopping together the way family shops together. They were holding hands. My father had watched them from a distance for several minutes before he understood what he was seeing. He had not approached them. He had gone back to his truck and sat there until he felt steady enough to drive home. I sat at my parents' kitchen table and heard my mother say the words and felt nothing for about 15 seconds. Then everything arrived at once. I called Renata from my parents' driveway. She answered on the second ring. When I said her name, she went quiet. I did not ask her anything. I simply said, "I know you were in Brandon today." She exhaled, then she said, "I was going to tell you." I drove home that night with Maisie asleep in the back seat, and thought about every single Sunday dinner, every cancelled plan, every careful question about how Preston was doing. By the time I pulled into our garage, I had stopped crying. Not because I was finished feeling it. Because I was somewhere past the point where crying made any difference. Renata and I talked for 4 hours after Maisie was in bed. I will not repeat all of it. Some of it was her crying. Some of it was her trying to explain. Which was not the same as explaining. She said it had started 8 months ago. She said it had not been planned. She said she still loved me, which was the cruelest thing she said. And the most honest. I asked her if Preston knew about the family I had built. She looked confused. I clarified. Did he understand while this was happening that he was sleeping with his brother's wife? She said yes. I called Preston that same night. He did not pick up. He texted me an hour later. Just 2 words. "I'm sorry." I did not respond. The next morning I drove to my parents' house in Brandon. I needed to see them. Not for comfort, exactly, but because there is a part of you, even at 31 years old, even as a man who prides himself on handling things, that needs to stand in front of his parents and hear them say which side they are standing on. My mother hugged me for a long time when I came in. My father shook my hand and then pulled me into a hug, which was unusual for him. They sat with me at the kitchen table and let me talk. I told them everything. I told them 8 months. I told them that Preston had been in our home. That Maisie called him Uncle Prez and asked him to do voices before bed. I told them that I did not understand how my brother could look me in the eye at Sunday dinner for 8 months, and I told them that I did not understand how Renata could come home and kiss Maisie goodnight. And then, I stopped. I couldn't finish that sentence. My father said, "This is unforgivable." I remember feeling something loosen in my chest when he said that. Like a knot. Coming undone. Just those 3 words. This is unforgivable. They were not asking me to see Preston's side. They were not qualifying anything. They were just standing beside me in the ruin of something and telling me the truth. That lasted about 2 weeks. Preston called our parents. I know this because my mother told me carefully. During a phone call, she was clearly trying to manage information. He had called them crying. He said he was in a bad place. He said he didn't know how it had happened. He said he loved Renata. That last part was delivered with a silence after it. Like my mother was waiting to see how I would react. I asked her what she had said to him. She said we told him we needed time. I said okay. 3 weeks later my father called me to say that Preston was coming home for Easter. I was quiet for a moment. I said, "I won't be there if he is." My father's voice shifted. He said, "Joel, I know this is hard. But he is still our son. We can't just cut him off." I sat with that for a second. Then I said, "You can do whatever you need to do. But I am telling you that I will not sit at the same table as him." My father said, "Your mother and I were hoping you could try to be in the same room. For the sake of the family, for the sake of the family." There it is. I have thought about that phrase so many times in the years since. What family were they referring to? Not the one I had built and that had just been destroyed from the inside. They meant the family as an institution. The one where everyone shows up at Easter and nobody says anything true and the whole thing holds together. Because people are willing to swallow enough pain to keep the surface intact. I said, "I'm not coming to Easter." My mother called the next day. She was gentler, but the message was the same. She talked about how Preston was struggling. She said she was worried about him. She said she knew it wasn't fair to ask, but could I just consider that he was carrying a lot of guilt? That guilt was a kind of suffering too. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Mom, I need to ask you something. Is Preston suffering more than I am right now?" She said, "Of course not. But I'm his mother too." There it was again. The thing I want to say about my parents is that they were not bad people. They were not cruel or calculating. They were people who had spent 30 years managing Preston's messes, and had built a habit they did not know how to break. Covering, for him, softening his consequences. Reminding whoever was hurt that he felt bad about it, as if feeling bad was a form of making things right. I had watched this my entire life, and told myself it didn't affect me. I was the one who didn't need it. I was the self-sufficient one. The one who figured things out. What I did not understand until that spring, sitting in my empty house while Maisie watched cartoons. And Renata lived in a hotel, and Preston sent me unanswered apology texts. Was that the story I had been told about myself? You're the strong one. You can handle it, you don't need as much, was not a compliment. It was an instruction. It was the family's way of telling me that my pain would be absorbed, and it would be absorbed quietly, because there was always something more urgent to protect. I did not go to Easter. Preston went to Easter. My parents sent me photos from the dinner table. That was not intentional cruelty. I know that now, but at the time, it felt like an answer to a question I had been afraid to ask. I filed for divorce in May. Renata and I agreed on shared custody. I got a family lawyer, and we worked out the details over several months. I am not going to say that was easy, because it wasn't. Maisie was 4 years old and asking why she had 2 bedrooms now and whether it was because she had done something bad. I spent a lot of nights sitting on the floor of her room after she fell asleep, just being in the same space as her. Because it was the only place where things felt uncomplicated. Preston and Renata did not last. I found out about 8 months after the divorce was final, through a mutual acquaintance. By then I had already started thinking about leaving Winnipeg. Maisie was in junior kindergarten. My commercial renovation job had wrapped up. I had saved enough to start fresh somewhere, and every time I drove past the farmer's market or the restaurant we used to go to as a family, or the park where Maisie had her first birthday party, I felt the weight of a life that had been quietly dismantled while I was busy trusting the wrong people. I called my parents and told them I was moving to Halifax. My mother cried. My father said, "That's very far." I said yes. He said, "What about your business?" I said, "I'll build another one." He said, "What about Maisie's school?" I said, "She'll make new friends." Then he said the thing I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. He said, "Joel, we understand you're angry with Preston. But is moving across the country really necessary?" I said, "This isn't about Preston." He said, "Then what is it about?" I said, "It's about me not wanting to live where every corner is a reminder. It's about Maisie growing up somewhere that isn't full of the wreckage of something that should never have happened. It's about me needing to be somewhere new, so I can figure out who I am outside of all of this." My father was quiet for a moment, then he said, "We support you. We just wish it didn't have to be so far." I heard in that sentence everything he was not saying. He was not saying I was wrong to leave. He was saying he wished things had been different. He wished the damage had been smaller. He wished there was a version of this, where everyone could still sit at the same table, and things could eventually go back to something resembling normal. I understood that wish. I just didn't share it. I moved to Halifax in October. Maisie started school in November 2 months late, and her teacher called me in December to say she had already made 3 friends, and was doing beautifully. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of the school after that call, and cried the way you cry when relief is so large. It doesn't fit anywhere else. I built the renovation business back up over 2 years. Started small, residential jobs. Word of mouth in a neighborhood where I knew nobody and nobody knew me or my story. That anonymity was for a long time the most peaceful thing in my life. My parents called every week. I answered most of the time. We talked about Maisie, about the business, about Halifax weather. We did not talk about Preston. That was an agreement we never made explicitly but kept anyway. My mother broke it once, about 8 months after I moved. She mentioned, carefully, that Preston was seeing someone new. She said it the way you might mention that a storm had passed. Something she wanted me to know was over weather-wise. I said okay. She said, "I thought you'd want to know." I said, "I don't actually, but thank you." She did not bring it up again. The silence around Preston lasted almost 3 years. In that time, I got one text from him directly. It said, "I think about what I did every day. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I just want you to know I'm sorry." I read it several times. Then I put my phone down and made breakfast for Maisie and did not respond. That was not cruelty on my part. I want to be clear about that. It was self-preservation. Because every time Preston's name entered my life, I felt a pull back towards something I had worked very hard to open up. Not anger exactly. Something older and quieter. The feeling of being the one who absorbs it, the one who is fine, the one who can handle it. I was done handling it. Maisie grew. That is the truest and most remarkable thing that happened during those years. She grew and she changed, and she became someone specific, with opinions about books and strong feelings as which soccer position was the most important, and a habit of narrating her food choices at restaurants in a voice that made every server within ear shot smile. She was funny. She was sharp. She had my stubbornness, and what her teacher called an unusually well-developed sense of fairness. I thought about what she was learning from me. What story about family and love and consequences she was absorbing just by living in my house and watching how I moved through the world. It scared me sometimes. Not the big obvious fears, the quiet ones. The fear that she would grow up thinking that you had to earn the right to take up space. That love meant making yourself small so others could be comfortable. I started therapy when Maisie was 7. I want to say that clearly because I think men of my generation are sometimes embarrassed by that, and I have no interest in being embarrassed by the smartest thing I did during that period of my life. My therapist's name is Dr. Brinney. She is based in Halifax. She has a calm voice and a bookshelf behind her that I have spent many sessions analyzing, and she was the first person to say something to me that rearranged something in my chest. She said, "It sounds like you were taught that being low maintenance was your job." I sat with that for a long time. The other thing that changed in that period was Vivienne. We met at a fundraiser for a local youth soccer league, because Maisie had somehow convinced me to volunteer for the setup crew, and Vivienne was the event coordinator, who handed me a box of folding tables and told me to put them along the east wall, which she specified very carefully, even though there was clearly only one possible wall she could mean. I fell for her slowly, and then, all at once, the way you fall for something when you weren't looking for it. She had no patience for pretense. She was direct in a way that sometimes startled me, and that I came to understand was the thing I had been missing my entire life. She asked real questions and waited for real answers. When I told her about what had happened with Preston and Renata, she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "How long did it take you to stop being angry at yourself for trusting them?" I said, "I don't know that I have." She said, "That's the part that takes the longest." She was right. My parents met Vivienne on a visit to Halifax when Maisie was 8. My mother loved her immediately. My father shook her hand and then said, in an aside to me that he thought was quiet, "She seems solid." This was my father's highest compliment, and we both knew it. That visit was the most normal week I had experienced with my parents in years. We took Maisie to Peggy's Cove. We ate fish and chips. My father helped me fix a railing on my back deck that I had been meaning to get to for months. My mother sat in the kitchen with Vivienne for 2 hours one afternoon, and I could hear them laughing from the backyard. On the last evening before they flew home, my father and I sat on the deck after Maisie was asleep. It was that particular maritime summer dark that isn't fully dark, just a kind of deep blue that holds the last of the light. He said, "Halifax suits you." I said, "I think so too." We were quiet for a while. Then he said, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened with Preston." I waited, he said. "I don't know if I handled it right." That sentence surprised me. My father was not a man who revisited decisions. He was not given to admitting uncertainty about the past. I said, "What do you think you would do differently?" He thought about it. Then he said, "I think I would have made it clearer to him that what he did was not something we could paper over. I think I let him come home too soon." I nodded. He said, "I think we made it too easy for him, always. And then when it mattered we kept on making it easy." I said, "Yeah, you did." He looked at me. I didn't say it unkindly. I just said it. He said, "I'm sorry, Joel." And he meant it. I could hear that he meant it. Not the managed version of sorry that comes with an explanation attached. Just the word, carrying all the weight of everything that should have been different. I said, "I know, Dad." We sat there for another hour not saying anything. And it was the closest I had felt to him in years. That night I went to bed and lay awake for a while and thought about what I wanted. What I actually wanted from my parents, from the future. From the version of family that was still available to me. I did not want the old version back. I did not want the table at Easter, where everyone smiled, and nobody said anything true. I did not want my daughter growing up in a world where you absorbed betrayal quietly and called it love. But I did want my parents. I did want the real ones, the ones who could sit on a deck in Halifax and say, "I think I would have done it differently." That version of them, the honest one, was someone I could build something with. Not something rebuilt. Something new. Preston called me the following spring. I almost did not answer. My thumb hovered over the screen for longer than I would like to admit. Then I answered. He said, "Hey." I said, "Hey." We were quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know you don't owe me anything. I just wanted to hear your voice." I said, "Okay." He said, "I've been sober for 14 months. I said, "I didn't know you had a drinking problem." He said, "Neither did I for a while." I didn't say anything. He went on. He said, "I've been in therapy." He said, "I've been sitting with what I did and trying to understand it, not to make excuses, just to understand it." He said, "I think I spent my whole life believing that things would work out for me because they always had. Because people always made them work out. And then when I wanted something I shouldn't have, I didn't stop myself. Because stopping myself was never something I'd had to practice. I sat with that for a long time." He said, "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't think I deserve that. I just wanted to tell you that I see it now, what I did, what it cost you." I said, "What do you think it cost me?" He was quiet. Then he said, "Your marriage, your home, Years of watching Maisie grow up every second day instead of every day. The version of your life that should have been. I said yeah. He said I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I said no, it doesn't. Another silence. Then I said I appreciate you saying it. He exhaled. Like he had been holding his breath for years. I did not invite him into my life. I want to be clear about that. I did not say, let's put this behind us. I did not say we're brothers, come for Christmas. I said, I appreciate you saying it, and I meant that, and that was all I had. He said, that's enough. Then he said goodbye. And I said goodbye. I told Vivienne about the call that night. She listened all the way through without saying anything. Then she said, how do you feel? I said, like I put something down that I didn't know I was still carrying. She nodded. I said, it doesn't change anything. She said, it doesn't have to. That was it. Maisie turned 9 in March. My parents drove to Halifax for her birthday, which they had done every year for the past 4 years, and which had become something I looked forward to, in a way that still surprised me a little. My mother brought a lemon tart from a bakery in Brandon that Maisie had decided was her favorite thing in the world, after trying it at my parents' place 2 years earlier. It was her birthday request every single year. My mother packed it very carefully and put it in her carry-on. At the birthday dinner, Maisie sat at the head of the table with the tart in front of her, and a candle shaped like the number 9, and looked around at her family. Me and Vivienne. My parents, 2 kids from her class. Her soccer coach, who was basically part of the furniture at this point. She said, okay, I have thought about my wish for a very long time. She blew out the candle. Then she looked up and said, I wished for nothing. Because I have everything I want right now. My mother looked at me over Maisie's head. My father looked out the window. Vivienne pretended to be very interested in her fork. I looked at my daughter, 9 years old. Confident, rooted, free of the particular kind of sadness that comes from growing up in a family where love is conditional, and pain gets managed instead of honored. I had been so afraid of what she was absorbing from me. The brokenness, the distance, the way I sometimes went quiet when I was trying to hold something together inside. But sitting at that table, listening to her say she had everything she wanted, I understood something I had not been able to see before. She had absorbed something from me. She had, but it was not the brokenness. It was the part that came after. The part where you pick up your daughter and your essentials. And you drive 1,200 kilometers toward somewhere you've never been. And you build something from nothing. Not from anger. Not from spite. But from the knowledge that you and your kid deserve better than what you were being offered. She had learned that from me. She had learned that love is not the same as tolerance. That family is something you earn through honesty, protection. Not just through showing up and expecting to be forgiven. She had learned that walking away from something broken is not the same as giving up. She had learned that starting over is one of the most courageous things a person can do. I did not plan to teach her any of that. I was just trying to survive. But somehow in surviving, I taught her the thing that mattered most. My parents flew home 2 days after Maisie's birthday. At the airport, my father hugged me for a long time. He said, come home for Christmas this year. I said, we'll come home for Christmas. He said, and bring the lemon tart woman. I said, I'll tell Vivienne you said that. He laughed. It was a real laugh. We are not the family we were before any of this happened. We will never be that family again. There are things I lost that I will not get back. There is a version of Maisie's early childhood that should have looked different. That should have had more Sunday dinners with a whole family at the table and less driving across the city to a custody handoff in a parking lot. Preston is not part of my life. That is a boundary I have kept and intend to keep. Not out of hatred, but out of an honest assessment of what is possible and what is healthy. I wish him well. I mean that, the way you can mean something from a very great distance. My parents are different now. Or maybe they were always capable of this version of themselves and it just took losing me to surface it. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is that when they came to Halifax for Maisie's 9th birthday, my father helped her set up a new bookshelf in her room. And my mother sat at my kitchen table and cried a little over the lemon tart, and nobody pretended that the last 6 years had not happened. Vivienne came into the kitchen while my mother was crying and handed her a tissue without saying anything. My mother took it. Vivienne made tea. That small moment, my mother with a tissue, Vivienne making tea, me standing in the doorway of my own kitchen in Halifax. Watching the women I love most in the world exist quietly together in the same space, felt like something. Not the end of the story. Not a reunion, just proof that the door was still open. Maisie put a photo on the bookshelf in her room. I noticed it a few days after the party. It was from that evening, the 9 candles, the lemon tart, all of us crammed around the table looking at her. She is in the center with her eyes closed mid-wish. On the back, she had written in her careful printing, the best one yet. I put the photo back on the shelf. Then I went downstairs and called my mother to tell her we would be home for Christmas. We told my brother that what he did was a mistake anyone could make. We asked the person he hurt most to keep the peace. so the rest of us could be comfortable. So he moved. He moved across the country, with his daughter and his pride, and the very last of his trust. And then, one very slow year at a time, he built something the old version of his family could never have given him. Not a second chance. A first one.